Our next speaker is Professor Robert Costanza. He is a Vice Chancellor's Chair in Public Policy at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. He's also currently a Senior Fellow at the Stockholm Resilience Center in Stockholm and Affiliate Fellow at the Gund Institute at the University of Vermont and a Ditao Master of Ecological Economics at the Ditao Masters Academy in Shanghai. Professor Costanza's transdisciplinary research integrates the study of humans and the rest of nature to address research policy and management issues at multiple time and space scales, from small watersheds to the global system. He is co-founder and past president of the International Society for Ecological Economics and was founding chief editor of the Society's journal Ecological Economics. He's also founding co-editor-in-chief of Solutions, a unique hybrid academic popular journal, and editor-in-chief of the Anthropocene Review. His awards include Kellogg National Fellowship, the Society for Conservative Biology Distinguished Achievement Award, and doctorates from Stockholm University and the École Normale Supérieure de Lyon. Dr. Costanza is the author or co-author of over 600 scientific papers and 28 books. And the title of his presentation today is Overcoming Our Societal Addiction to Growth. Professor Costanza, are you ready?
I'm ready, but I think you can't see me because my camera does not seem to be working. Can you see this? Can you see the slide?
Yeah, we see your full screen size.
Okay.
Slide.
Sorry about that. My camera usually works.
That's fine. It happens.
Okay, so, and hi, Bill. I see that Bill Reese was just giving a talk. Is he still on? How are you doing? So, overcoming our societal addiction to growth is what I'm going to talk about. And I think that's a key reason that we haven't made the changes that we need to make quickly enough. First of all, recognizing that we live in a whole new geologic epoch called the Anthropocene, due to the magnitude of the human impact on planet Earth. So we're not in an empty world any longer, empty of humans, relatively empty of humans and their artifacts, but relatively full. This means that business as usual is not really an option going forward. If our goal, and I think it should be, our goal to create a sustainable and desirable Anthropocene, we need to think and act differently. I think the time is well past, actually, to build an economy and a society based on the goal of sustainable well-being of humans and the rest of nature. And I word that in that way just to emphasize the fact that, you know, we are a part of nature. We're not separate from nature. And this, in the Anthropocene, those interconnections have to be taken a lot more seriously. And we have to look at the whole system, the whole Earth system as an integrated thing, if we hope to achieve this goal of sustainable well-being. And there are at least three elements to this. First of all, having an adequate vision of how the world is, our scientific understanding of the world, and understanding that whole integrated system, I think, is the problem. How do we put all the pieces together? And I think we're making a lot of progress in that regard with Earth system science and some transdisciplinary fields that I'll talk about, but there's still a long way to go. And the other part of that is our vision of how we would like the world to be. You know, as the great American baseball player and philosopher Yogi Berra once said, if you don't know where you're going, you end up somewhere else. How do we create a shared vision of the kind of world that we're really trying to create in order to motivate change toward it? And our tools and analytical techniques, I think, have to also modify and broaden to talk about systems thinking and modeling. How do we understand the whole system? And I think we need some implementation strategies that involve new, different kinds of institutions capable of dealing with this new Anthropocene world and societal therapy to overcome our addictions. So you've probably all seen some version of this idea of planetary boundaries, that there are fundamental ecological constraints in this Anthropocene world. And we're already exceeding some of the safe operating boundaries or space for humans when it comes to climate change, biodiversity, the biogeochemical cycles. So we have to recognize that we do have these fundamental ecological constraints, and we have to realize that the world is a complex, nonlinear, adaptive system. It has thresholds, it has tipping points, there are surprises. This is just a slide of some of the climate tipping points that are out there that we may very soon run into. You know, the melting of the ice sheets, you know, the changes in El Nino. So there's a whole range of these things that could really accelerate climate change. On the other hand, there are social tipping points that I think we're also approaching that could counteract some of these things. So that this view of the system that we are running into huge problems is certainly true, but it's not the movie that most people are lining up to go see, unfortunately. Start my video.
I just try and get a gain, but no, it doesn't seem to work.
Sorry.
No problem.
Everything's still going okay? You can
Yes,
still
perfect.
see it? Yeah, okay. I think, oops. Ultimately, though, I think we need a third movie. We need, you know, a better narrative, a vision of a sustainable and desirable economy in society in the rest of nature, recognizing this embeddedness and interconnections between these three parts of the system, a sustainable well-being economy. So we need to stay within planetary boundaries, but we also need to create the elements of human well-being and quality of life within those boundaries, the sustainable and desirable donut, as it's been called. Here's another way of looking at our agenda going forward from a paper by Zume Bai and others. Just recognizing that our societal goals are extremely important to build consensus about, to tell us what kinds of interventions and transformations are needed in order to achieve the kind of Anthropocene future that we desire, as opposed to the kinds that we don't want. But that's all contingent on better understanding of our biophysical constraints, our social conditions, and trends, etc. So understanding this larger complex system. This has been the goal, I think, of ecological economics from the beginning, focused on these three integrated questions or goals of how do we establish an ecologically sustainable scale or size or magnitude of the economic component of the system or the economic subsystem within the larger ecological life support system. How do we create and maintain a socially fair distribution of wealth and resources between both among the current generation of humans, but also between the current and future generations and between humans and other species? And how do we create an economically efficient allocation of resources that recognizes all of the things that contribute to our well-being, not just marketed goods and services, but also our natural, our social capital, things that are not marketed and shouldn't be marketed, but that have an extremely large effect on our sustainable well-being. So this is only one of several overlapping ideas that you've probably heard about along the way. You know, the well-being economy, the circular bioeconomy, the regenerative economy, ecological civilization, the donut economy, steady-state economy. I think there's a large number of groups and individuals that are thinking along similar lines these days. And so I think this is, we're building to hopefully a social tipping point in that regard. Just to summarize the differences between the empty world vision of the economy, which it starts with these basic primary resources of land, labor, and capital, but assumes that there's almost perfect substitutability between these factors. We don't really need land or natural resources. We just need more capital and labor to produce more marketed goods and services as measured by GDP, which are then either consumed or reinvested to build more capital so that this whole cycle can continue indefinitely. There's nothing in this vision that prevents GDP from growing forever. There's nothing in this vision that says that we need anything much more than simply consumption of marketed goods and services. The more we consume, the better off we are. Let's just keep the whole thing going. Okay, there are some major flaws in that vision, in the Anthropocene, at least, you know, in this full world vision. we have to recognize we live in a materially closed Earth system. We have to recognize that these four basic types of capital assets are all required in a more balanced way to produce conventional goods and services, but also more importantly to produce well-being more broadly conceived. So in addition to conventional built capital, we have human capital. It's more than human labor. It's everything having to do with individuals, their health, their education, their individual well-being, but also social capital, all of the interactions and networks among individuals, all of our institutions and cultures, etc. All of those things that are essential to making the system function as a community, as a group of individuals. So anything having to do with more than one person is a part of our social capital. The market itself is a form of social capital. And in order for human systems to function, we have to build trust. We have to build the ability to interact with other people. That's our social capital, and that's been depleted a lot in recent times. And finally, our natural capital, everything else that we didn't have to create, but that is utilized in the creation of all of these other forms of capital. And that contributes to well-being, as I said, both through the production of goods and services, but also directly, in terms of ecological services and amenities. This idea of well-being is also getting a lot of attention and research recently, with ideas around positive psychology, what actually does contribute to people's quality of life and well-being. And there's been a lot of work, surveying people and asking them, how satisfied are they with their lives, and what does that depend on? And ultimately, it depends on satisfying a whole range of human needs, much more than simply consumption and subsistence. But there have been various lists like this created, going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and more recently Manfred Max Neef and Barbara Nussbaum and others, and Amartya Sen. So there's versions of this list, but you can recognize in this list things that do actually contribute to your well-being, weighted in different ways by different personalities and different cultures, etc. But what we can do from a policy perspective is create the opportunities for people to meet those needs, to both now and in the future, by how we arrange our assets, our built, our human, our social, our natural capital, and how we use our time. So an important component of that is the benefits that we derive from natural capital, from functioning ecosystems. This is from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment from several years ago, which categorizes these services into these four basic types of provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting services, and all of their various contributions to the constituents of human well-being. Things like not just food and water and fiber, the provisioning services, but regulating climate, regulating floods and diseases, etc., cultural and spiritual amenities, etc. One thing that was missing from this diagram, I think, was the interconnection with the other three forms of capital that I mentioned, the built, human, and social capital. And in fact, to create sustainable well-being, I think it requires this complex interaction of those four types of capital. Ecosystem services are the relative contribution of natural capital, but in combination with the other three types as well. So I think that's our challenge going forward. How do we understand and balance these assets? How do we invest in the assets that are now limiting the production of sustainable well-being? And I think currently those limiting factors are our natural capital and our social capital. There's been a lot of interest in this idea of ecosystem services. There's the creation of the IPBES, Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It's kind of the IPCC, but devoted to ecosystem services, and they produce sort of regular assessments, as the IPCC has done. At the intergovernmental level, there's the Ecosystem Services Partnership. If you take a look at this website, if you're interested in who's doing what around the world on this issue, and there are literally thousands of people involved in that. The research interest in ecosystem services has been going up exponentially. Currently there are almost 5,000 articles a year published on this topic in in Scopus and over 35,000 historically. The most highly cited of those was this one that we produced back in 1997, where we tried to estimate with a capital E the total value of 17 different ecosystem services across 16 different biomes, and we came up with an estimate, conservative estimate, that was larger than global GDP at the time by a huge margin. One thing we didn't control was what they put on the cover of the magazine. We did make the cover, so that was good, but they said pricing the planet rather than valuing the planet. We really want to emphasize the distinction between those two, because many of the services that we were estimating are not marketed and shouldn't be marketed. That's not where their value is coming from. It's coming from their contribution to well-being in other ways. We know that as we make changes in land use, as we have been doing over the last several hundred years, we move from systems that have high total value in terms of these ecosystem services to things that have more private value, but are losing much of the social value from the other services. So when we take an intact wetland and convert it to farming, we're losing more than half of the total value of that system. Likewise for several other land use transformations. Several years ago, we tried to estimate the benefit cost ratio of preserving our natural capital assets using this global scenario and saying, what if we expanded the global reserve network to cover 15% of the terrestrial biosphere and 30% of the marine biosphere? That would cost us about $45 billion a year at the time, but would result in a net benefit, the difference between the intact system and what it might be converted to, of about 4 to 5 trillion a year. So benefit cost ratio of 100 to 1. Again, conservatively estimated. So in terms of our societal investments these days, our investments in natural capital and nature-based solutions of many different kinds, I think are much more effective than investments in other places in the economy. More recently, the TEEB study, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, has updated based on that additional research that's happened, the sort of average or unit values of these different ecosystems. You can see that they're all in the range of thousands to tens of thousands to even hundreds of thousands of dollars per hectare per year in terms of their total contribution to well-being. Based on that, we estimated, well, how have things changed since 1997? And based on those changes in land use and updates of the value of those ecosystems, and we've estimated that we were losing on the order of $4 to $20 trillion a year in ecosystem services due to those changes in land use. So things they're not getting better in that regard, but they can turn around. So that's on the natural capital side. On the social capital side, we also are in dire straits. And we know that the distribution of wealth and resources has a major impact on quality of life and on our ability to build social capital. And this is from a book by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, The Spirit Level, where they looked at the relationship between income inequality and this whole range of social problems, and got a very strong relationship. The higher the income inequality, the higher this whole group of social problems. You know, with Scandinavia, Japan down on this end, the United States up on this end. This is for just for OECD countries. But the impact of inequality, I think, has been getting a lot of attention and study more recently. And so we know that that affects quality of life quite dramatically. And we also know how to change it. We know that from the 1920s, to about 1980, income inequality was falling in most developed countries, or in this group of developed countries, largely due to progressive taxation and instituting sort of welfare state policies. Only after the Reagan-Thatcher sort of neoliberal revolution did that start going back in the other direction. And now income inequality is as bad as it was in the 1920s in the US. And we know that that's not the state that most people want to see either. This was a very interesting experiment where they surveyed 5,000 Americans. They asked them, what they thought the income distribution looked like. It was this kind of the center bar where they thought the top 20% made more than 50% of the income or wealth, and distributed like this. And then they compared that with the actual distribution of wealth at the time, which looks more like this. So much more unequal distribution of wealth. And they compared that with what the survey respondents said they would like the income distribution to be. And that was more like this bottom graph, which is more similar to Scandinavian distributions of wealth than American distributions of wealth. So this is not what people desire. And this was across the political spectrum, etc. So, and we know also that when you compare, per capita GDP with things like life satisfaction, based on these life satisfaction surveys, you get graphs that look something like this, where there's an initial strong correlation, but beyond a certain point, somewhere south of $10,000 per capita per year, that relationship kind of disappears, and it's levels off at least. So the relationship, or the idea that continuing to increase GDP per capita, beyond a certain point is the main goal, is brought into question. Countries with much lower GDPs per capita have at least equivalent life satisfaction, and this is partly because of how that GDP is distributed and what the side effects of that GDP production are. So we've known from the inception of GDP that it was not designed as a measure of societal well-being. As Simon Kuznets said in this quote, the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income as defined by GDP. So goals for more growth should specify of what and for what. What are we trying to improve? Is it just consumption, or is it really quality of life? Is it really well-being? And if that's the case, how do we get there? And in order to do that, I think we have to think differently and get beyond GDP as a measure of progress. As we've said, there've been a whole lot of alternatives proposed to GDP, including Canadians' Wellbeing indicator. I'm not sure if I have that on. Yeah, the Canadian Index of Wellbeing is one of those. This graph is broken into three groups. The first group that sort of modifies GDP and other macroeconomic indicators to incorporate some of these ideas. I'll talk a bit about the genuine progress indicator that does that. A group that surveys life satisfaction more directly. The World Values Survey, there's the Bhutan's Gross National Happiness Index. There's some work in Australia that's been done along those lines, and I'll show some examples of that. And finally, there are indices that are built up from other indicators in various ways. The Human Development Index is one of those that you probably have heard about, this Canadian Index of Wellbeing. I'll mention the OECD Better Life Index, which is the latest one of those. The life satisfaction surveys, I'm not sure if you can see these, but they've done these surveys in 157 different countries and report this almost annually. This is from a couple of years ago. And you can see that Scandinavia in general, Canada ranks number 6 here at 7.4 out of 10 in terms of people's average life satisfaction scores when they ask people, on a all things considered, how satisfied are you with your life overall? And this is kind of the range of scores that they get. One interesting thing they did here was to break this down and say how much of that score is explained by GDP per capita as opposed to social support, healthy life expectancy, freedom to make life choices, things that have to do more with the social and human capital components. Generosity, they didn't really include a natural capital component in this survey, but I think that explains a large part of what's left over here. But one major point is that GDP, is roughly 10% or so of the variation in life satisfaction. It's important, but it's certainly not as important as it is sometimes made out to be. All of these other things are also important, and we're sort of ignoring those. Another, this index approach is this OECD Better Life Index. This one has to do with this range of, 11 different indicators, from housing, income, jobs, education. They include life satisfaction as one of the indicators. And then they create these sort of amoeba diagrams or flower diagrams to show where countries are on each of these indicators. In this particular year, Australia came out at the top of the heap, and it sort of brought out one of the issues with this kind of indicator, because you're coming up with some way of measuring, each of these things, and then you're combining them. In this case, it's weighting everything equally. But for example, in Australia, the indicator that they use for civic engagement is what percentage of the population votes in elections. And in Australia, you're required to vote. You're fined if you don't vote. So they get very high voter turnout. But whether that is a good indicator of civic engagement is another question. It's likewise for many of these things. What are they using as the underlying indicator? And also, how are things weighted? So one thing that they did really nicely, I think, was to allow you to change the weighting. You could go on their website and slide these weights, over and say, I want environment to be more important than simply the same as everything else, and see how that changes the rankings. The last one I'll talk about is the genuine progress indicator, which starts with personal consumption expenditures, which is a major component of GDP, but it weights it by income distribution, recognizing that this inequality component and the distribution of income has a huge impact on welfare, not just as opposed to just income. It adds a few things that are left out of GDP, like the value of household labor and the value of volunteer work, very important contributors to human and societal well-being, but not marketed, not counted in GDP. And it subtracts a whole bunch of things that shouldn't be counted as positives. The loss of leisure time, the cost of crime, a whole range of natural capital components, the cost of air and water pollution and noise pollution, etc. This index, the GPI, has been applied in several countries around the world, and this is 17 of them that we collected for the study. And you can see that the general trend is, increasing GPI per capita for a period, and then things start to go south after about 1980 in many countries. When you put this all together, you can see that GDP per capita globally looks like this. GPI per capita, on the other hand, has peaked around 1980 and started leveling off. So you've gone from a period of what Herman Daly has called economic growth to a period of uneconomic growth. The economy's growing, but it's not really improving well-being, and so it's not really an economic growth. So I think that's one of the key things we need to bring out, that we're following the wrong lead here. If we put too much emphasis on GDP growth, we need to really look much more broadly at what does contribute to well-being. A couple of states in the US have picked up this idea. Maryland started using the GPI as part of their policy discussions. The state of Vermont has incorporated GPI into the legislation, so it has to be calculated every year and used to guide some policy decisions. So there is some progress at the governmental level. And I think but I think we still have a long way to go. And I think ultimately we need to build better systems for modeling and measuring well-being in connection with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but in general. So we need to move beyond the current version of GPI, which includes the costs, the depletion of natural capital, and some of the social capital components, to the positive contributions of natural and social capital. How do we build a broader index of well-being that can be used to drive progress toward that goal? And I think ultimately that gets back to building a broader consensus about what is our goal. So if we're going to create this sustainable well-being economy, it's going to require breaking our addiction to this growth at all costs economic paradigm, to fossil fuels, to overconsumption, et cetera. The reason that we're still doing this, is that these things have positive short-term effects, like a drug addiction. They do produce positive things in the short term, but very negative things in the long term, and we're beginning to realize that. But the question is, once we've recognized this problem as an addiction, how do we overcome it? What is the therapy? And I think a key step in that therapy is building this shared vision of the kind of world that we really want, and building a vision of how that world functions. So we've done some work with psychologists, Tim Kasser in particular, looking at, well, what can we learn from what works at the individual level to overcome addictions that can be applied at the societal level. And it turns out that there's one fairly effective therapy at the individual level called motivational interviewing. And this is based on not confronting addicts with the problem so directly, but starting with engaging them in a positive discussion of their goals, their motives, their what kind of life they want for themselves in the future. So and using that then recognition of their goals to motivate change. So the obvious analogy for that at the societal level is, how do we build a shared vision of our societal goals? The SDGs, I think, are a major step in that direction. It's the first time in human history, really, when all countries in the world have agreed on a broad set of societal goals. And they go far beyond, number 8 here, which is good jobs and economic growth, but they include all of the other things that I've been talking about in terms of reduced inequalities, in terms of protecting our natural capital, climate, marine and terrestrial resources, etc. So, this combination of goals, I think, is an important first step. They're also beginning to recognize that these are not independent goals. They are all interconnected. They have their synergies and trade-offs among them. They all contribute to this next level of goals of sustainable scale, fair distribution, and efficient allocation in different ways, in different contexts, in different countries, and ultimately to our overarching goal of how do we build this prosperous, high quality of life that's equitably shared and sustainable. So understanding that those interconnections and contributions, I think, is also a key research problem. And recognizing that those goals are embedded in the way that I talked about before, that the economy is embedded within society and the biosphere. We have to understand this whole interconnected system. And ultimately, we have to create better stories and visions of what this positive future for the world might look like. This is a book that we produced that's a collection of essays where we ask authors to answer that question directly. What would this world look like if it was the kind of world that we all want? There's also a lot of work that's been done in scenario planning. Let's look at alternative futures, alternative plausible futures, and use that to help guide our discussions about the kind of world we want and how to get there. Going back to work that was done in South Africa, post-apartheid, the IPCC uses these kinds of scenarios all the time. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment also was based on a range of scenarios. I'll talk a bit more about the Great Transition Initiative that's been going on for quite a while, based on, and often they fall into these four basic types of scenarios that sort of bracket the range of possible futures. Usually from a least desirable to a most desirable type. For example, the Great Transition Initiative scenarios are these 4, and you can array them along these 2 axes. There's some that are focused on continued GDP growth, conventional business as usual, what they call market forces, a policy reform future, which is more government intervention. You try to deal with equity in that way, but still focused on GDP. So the green growth agenda, you could think of as that sort of scenario. Fortress world is, everyone for themselves, a sort of collapse kind of scenario, or at least a much more inequitable world. And finally, the Great Transition Initiative is based on, community and a focus on a broader conception of well-being. We're all in it together. You need polycentric governance at many levels. You need stewardship and sharing rather than everyone for themselves. So I think that Great Transition Initiative scenario corresponds quite closely with the SDGs going forward. And the problem, I think, is how do we communicate these visions of the world to not just policymakers, but to the broader public? How do we engage the public in this process of building a shared vision? And I think that really is what democracy should be all about. How do we decide as a community the kind of world that we want in order to motivate us getting there? So this is just one way of describing those 4 alternative futures in a simple picture. But I think we could go a lot further than that. And we're working now with some filmmakers to try to build sort of video representations of what life would be like in each of these 4 different scenarios. Generally, you get people that are okay with maybe these 3. Certainly, no one wants to go to Fortress World. Well, maybe there's a few billionaires that might want to be there, and often you can see that the current state of the world, we're heading in. It's not like we're all heading towards one vision. There's different parts of the world that are headed towards different versions of these visions. We tried to engage the general public in this process with a survey that we did in Australia a few years, well, fairly recently, a couple of years ago. We changed the titles of these 4 scenarios, but they were quite similar, we changed them to try to make them a little less value laden. Instead of saying Fortress World, we said strong individualism. Instead of saying the Great Transition, which is maybe a little too positive, we said community well-being, etc. So you can see how we changed those titles, but the underlying characteristics of those visions, I think, were quite similar. We then had a website where we asked people to read about each of these visions and then go and take a SurveyMonkey survey, and we got these sorts of results. Where the community well-being scenario was obviously the top choice among most people, but you certainly still had a subset who thought strong individualism was their first choice, and some of the others as well. So we're continuing to work on this issue of how do you build a shared vision of the kind of world that we really want. How do we get that out to the general public? And I'm open to any suggestions that others might have in that regard. And finally, I'll end with what's is this even possible? The one argument that will come back is, well, we cannot have a society where GDP is not growing. We're just it's just not going to work. I think that's part of the addiction denial phenomena. But there has been some work done on just that question. Peter Victor, who I'm sure who some of you know, produced this book called Managing Without Growth. He's from York University. And Tim Jackson had a book called Prosperity Without Growth. Peter did a macroeconomic model of the Canadian economy. And he asked the question, well, what if you just turned off GDP, just stopped growing? Well, yeah, that could be a disaster. But on the other hand, you could develop a low or no growth economy that was positive, that had all the characteristics that we're talking about. And that took changes. And I summarized those policy changes that were required to get to a no or low growth, a positive economy as this 12-step program. The 12 things we need to change to get there. And so, first of all, we need new meanings and measures of success. We see something like GPI or a well-being indicator to help guide that direction. We need to get off of GDP as our major indicator. We need limits on materials, energy, waste, and land use. We need to stay within planetary boundaries, basically. We need more meaningful prices. The market is not telling us the full cost of everything that we're producing and consuming, because it's leaving out the externalities of the damages to the environment, the damages to social capital. So we need to bring those in. We need more durable, repairable products. That's kind of obvious. We don't necessarily need to make more stuff simply to stimulate GDP. We need to make things that do contribute to well-being. We need fewer status goods. So we shouldn't be consuming things simply to build status. We should be consuming things that contribute to our well-being, and we can build status in other ways that are not so consumptive, not so destructive of the other parts of the system that contribute to our well-being. More informative advertising. We don't need advertising that makes us feel unhappy and that the only way to be happy is to buy and consume more stuff. We need advertising that just tells us what the products do. We need better screening of technology that tells us, technology is a good servant but a poor master. So how do we understand the kind of technology that really will contribute to our well-being rather than pursuing everything that we possibly can? We need more efficient capital stock. So that's the corollary of the more efficient consumption items. Now we want things that last longer, that are more efficient in their production. We need more local, less global, and this is not so much simply to reduce transport costs, but to build social capital in the local economy. How do we make sure that we do as much as we can with our local resources in order to build social capital? Reduced inequality, we talked a lot about that already. That's an obvious contribution to building social capital, which contributes to well-being. Less work, more leisure. It's hard to find anybody that will object to this as a policy goal, but I think it's important to think that way. And we get people that are overworked because they're pursuing income, as a goal rather than quality of life. And that will make space for people who are underworked, and where that employment can contribute to their well-being. So we need to share the work more equitably and appreciate our leisure time as well. And finally, we need education for life and not just for work. So I think this is a critical one. We're not educating people simply to get a job, to make money, to buy stuff that they may or may not need. Education is really for people to understand the system, what does contribute to their quality of life, and how to pursue that well-being more effectively. And finally, I think we need some different institutions to achieve these kinds of goals. We need to get away from this idea that everything can be privatized, and to recognize that we need to deal with the common assets like our natural and social capital in a more effective way. This is partly because these are different types of goods fundamentally. Market goods and services are rival and excludable, but many of the things that contribute to our well-being are non-rival and non-excludable: public goods, common pool resources, etc. We've known this for a long time. Markets don't really work well for these types of goods and services. So it's not that we don't want markets at all, or we want everything to be considered a common good. We want to recognize what are the fundamental differences, and how do we build the right balanced mixture of property rights regimes and institutions to manage all of those different things. Oops. Elinor Ostrom had done a lot of work. She went on this topic. She won the Nobel Prize in Economics for her work on managing the commons, and she came up with a list of sort of 8 design principles that communities that did manage their common assets effectively all seem to have in common. You do need clearly defined boundaries. You can't maintain these systems as open access resources as they currently are, as the atmosphere and the oceans and many other common assets currently are. So you need to have clearly defined boundaries. You need to have collective choice arrangements. How do you get participation among all of the stakeholders in building the rules and also then enforcing and monitoring the rules? You need different good mechanisms for conflict resolution, and you also need what she calls polycentric governance. We need to maintain the ability to govern these systems at many different levels rather than being all top down or all bottom up. And finally, I think we need a much broader alliance of all of the individuals, institutions, governments, groups that are engaged in these kinds of ideas. And one thing I've been involved with is something called the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, or WEALL, which, and this is a picture from meeting in Scotland of the initiation that led to the initiation of the government group. There's a group of governments now that are that are basing their decisions on well-being rather than GDP growth. And that was led by Nicola Sturgeon, who was the First Minister of Scotland, and a group of countries, including New Zealand and I think currently Finland and Iceland are part of that group as well, and it's rapidly expanding. So take a look at the We All website, and hopefully you would all be interested in joining that alliance going forward, because I think we need to build this broad alliance of all of these groups to move this agenda forward. They have an agenda on how do we build back after the COVID pandemic to a world that is based on well-being, and the sort of range of principles. And many of the things that I've been talking about here are embedded in that. How do we build this broad alliance around the shared goals of building a sustainable and desirable future? And finally, one TED Talk I would recommend you take a look at is Nicola Sturgeon's TED Talk about the well-being economy. And I think getting government bodies, but also everyone else in the world involved in making this transition is really where we need to be headed. So that's all I had for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Great talk and great suggestions.